Tanse. My name is Erica Violet Lee. I'm an undergrad at the University of Saskatchewan. I wanted to say kinanis komatin to everyone for inviting me here today, especially for the organizers of the conference and the elders and people of this land for inviting me to speak. So this is where I'm from. This is Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, a city of 500,000 people in the middle of the Canadian prairies. Can everyone hear me okay? I have a cold, so I feel like I'm in a fishbowl right now, so I hope I'm projecting properly. So I'm Nehio, or Plains Cree, and my band is Thunderchild First Nation, who today are rallying against Bill C-27, which requires First Nations bands to submit all of their financial information to the Government of Canada, and although the government has no authority to demand this, bands that do not comply will risk losing what little funding they have left for schooling, housing, and infrastructure. On November 10th, 2012, we held the first Idle No More teach-in to educate the community on Bills C-31 and C-45, passed by the Conservative government run by Stephen Harper. These bills included laws to erode environmental protections, including the near-total deregulation of industrial corporations dumping waste into waterways, and changes to the Indian Act, which determines who is eligible to receive legal recognition as an Indigenous person. All of this legislation was passed silently, quickly, and without consultation or consent. From that small community center, within a month, we were planning international rallies and an International Day of Action on December 10th, 2012. Idle No More is part of a worldwide movement that exists not only to counter dominant narratives of colonial discourses, but to provide insight into entire systems of Indigenous knowledge that are suppressed. By challenging these narratives, Idle No More has quickly become one of the largest Indigenous mass movements in history, sparking hundreds of teach-ins, rallies, and protests across the world. What began as a series of small teach-ins throughout Saskatchewan to protest parliamentary bills has now changed the social and political landscape of North America. Far from presenting a hopeless scenario, Idle No More demonstrates possibilities of Indigenous people not simply surviving, but thriving. Idle No More is not a new movement, but simply a new name for hundreds of years of resistance. We had rallies all over the world, and I helped coordinate. There's some that I helped coordinate. I know that I was looking for pictures of Oklahoma, because there's some people here from Oklahoma.
I could have got you some of those.
Who are involved in Idle No More rallies. But we have pictures of Norway, Prague, and unfortunately, the only thing I remember about this year that was like hectic and crazy, and that whole winter is this. But there was about 3 feet of snow on the ground. In Saskatoon, and even though I only lived like 2 blocks away from the center, the community center where we had our first teach-in, I didn't want to walk because I was too lazy and cold, and I'm glad I did. Idle No More started in the winter, and although Canadian winters are notoriously fierce, are considered notoriously fierce, for example, when I left Saskatoon to come to this conference, it was negative 40 degrees Celsius. That didn't stop us. There were hundreds of actions across the world that winter. When people think of Canada, they often think of vast, cold, hostile terrain. They think of forests, oceans, plains, sprinkled sparingly with the occasional mountie or beaver. The idea of terra nullius, or unoccupied, unused, untouched land, is a colonial tactic used to claim the homes of Indigenous people. Historical acts of genocide are erased from the nation's memory and replaced with stories of fearless voyageurs and homesteaders. These narratives have been consistent throughout Canadian history and reveal an account of who and what the nation imagines itself to be. The logic of terra nullius and of extractive industries is applicable in examining the situation of Indigenous women in Canada as well. Since contact, we've been painted as more a part of nature than men because of our ability to bear children, which contributes to our exclusion from legal negotiations, where although many of our societies were matriarchal, the Crown representatives assumed that only the men were political leaders, giving them sole reign to sign treaties without the consent of the grandmothers. The logic of terra nullius, of chaotic, uncivilized, undeveloped nature, also contributes to sexual violence against Indigenous women. As Sarah Deer writes, in a 1909 congressional debate over punishments for perpetrators of sexual assault against Native women, U.S. Representative Norris indicated, the morals of Indian women are not always as high as those of a white woman, and consequently the punishment should be lighter against her. As recently as 1968, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld a law that imposed a harsher penalty for the rape of a non-Indian woman than an Indian woman, presumably because Congress viewed Native women as immoral and therefore unworthy of protection. Smith notes that this legal approach is justified in the colonial imagination because the rape of bodies that are considered inherently impure or dirty simply does not count. The vulnerability and exploitation of Indigenous lands has been connected to the vulnerability and exploitation of Indigenous women. They are both forms of violent domination and extraction without consent, where the needs of the taker are paramount. Gender and sexual violence are not simply tools of patriarchy, but also serve as tools of racism and colonialism. Andrea Smith states, in order to colonize a people whose society was not hierarchical, colonizers must first naturalize hierarchy through instituting patriarchy. So how do we fight back to this colonialism? There's an artist named Kent Monkman, and his method is to take these grand, vast sceneries of Canada that are so commonly depicted in paintings. Some of you may have heard of the Group of Seven, who became famous for painting Canadian wilderness and placing people on those lands. So if you can tell, this is a picture of an Indigenous person spanking a Mountie. So there were things happening on the lands. What all of these images serve to do is to restory Canada and restory the lands that we're on. And so it has to do with reclaiming spaces. One of the main tools of Idle No More was the round dance, the flash mob round dance. And so what that does is gets people back out on the land and puts us in spaces where people still think Indigenous people don't exist anymore in a lot of cases. So this is something that restoring and reclaiming spaces helps to break that. One way we reclaim the story of Indigenous women is through Indigenous feminisms. All of the experiences of marginalization, exploitation, and dehumanization of women in their life made me a feminist. But not because I believe Indigenous women are inherently vulnerable, helpless, and exploitable, because I know firsthand that we're resilient, strong, brilliant, and capable. What made me a feminist also made me passionate about Indigenous rights and the environment, and so I work within the Idle No More movement, which establishes a clear space for Indigenous women as leaders. In the book Feminism for Real, Shanga Tagore discusses Indigenous feminism as filling the gap. Some of us live our lives in the gap. This gap is where we were born, how we were displaced from our homes or removed from our histories. The gap is where we were forced to forget our languages, our traditions, and our cultures. In this gap, we love and express ourselves in ways that don't fit into neat categories, but instead shake the grip that rigid boundaries have upon our world. Look at the gap, acknowledge it, notice it, value it, and you'll see the complex and varied ways in which we fight, challenge, survive, celebrate, and love fiercely, even while enveloped in a system that enforces our separation of our spirits from ourselves. So what does my Indigenous feminism look like? My feminism looks like Shannon Kustachin, the young girl from Attawapiskat who fought for safe schooling in her community and inspired on-reserve youth across the country to do the same. It looks like Tennille Bear, a 13-year-old girl from North Battleford, Saskatchewan, who wore a hoodie that said "Got Land" and on the back, "Thank an Indian," into her small town school, and when the teacher and principal asked her to remove it because it was racist, she refused and was suspended. You can go to idlenomore.ca/got_land and download your own Got Land decal to support Tennille. My feminism looks like the Am I Next campaign, encouraging Indigenous women to recognize and confront the ways we're made vulnerable by colonial governments and the colonial police state, and the subsequent declaration of I'm Not Next, an attempt to claim agency in which the positioning of Indigenous women is inherently vulnerable, beings with no power to stop the violence inflicted upon us. My feminism looks like Chief Teresa Spence, whose body became the focus of national attention and criticism during her hunger strike, because as Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson points out, as a Native woman leader, everything from her weight to her manicure and her highlights were under a microscope, as her mere presence represented the continued existence and flourishing of Indigenous nations, of Indigenous political and legal orders. My feminism looks like the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, an organization led by Indigenous women across Canada that travel to small First Nations communities, spreading knowledge on how violence on our bodies is connected to violence on our lands, and that by teaching harm reduction methods and encouraging bodily sovereignty through sexual health education, we create stronger communities. What I really love about the work that we do with Native Youth Sexual Health Network is that it provides a vision of empowering sexuality, which is not something you see often in Indian country. As Drew Hayden Taylor puts it, oftentimes the only time you see in media anything about Native sexuality, it's either dead sex workers, high rates of STDs in Native communities, or abuse from residential schools. We have the highest birth rate of any culture in Canada, so there must be something fun and enjoyable about it. Actions with hundreds of people are beautiful, but Idle No More is about more than just the big rallies. It's about everyday resistance as well. The idea of resistance is encapsulated in the Nehewewin word, Sigiwewin, love in actions. As an Indigenous woman, choosing to wake up in the morning, to go to school or work, choosing to believe that you have a right to take up space is a political act. We resist essentially stereotypical limiting impositions on our identities and bodies as Indigenous people. And by doing that, we practice our sovereignty, whether it's through resisting gender binaries and honoring the numerous genders and sexualities that Neo people embraced pre-contact. Practicing sovereignty by refusing to believe that we have to work with mining and resource extraction companies that we know are inherently harmful to our lands and waters. This is in Elsipogtog, New Brunswick. We practice sovereignty by resisting toxic depictions of Indigenous masculinity that claim the strength of our men is only to be shown through violence, domination, and physical prowess. We practice sovereignty through stopping the shame and violence directed towards Indigenous women for exercising our reproductive rights, recognizing that some of us are life givers, mothers, sisters, daughters, but that the worth of our lives is not based solely on our reproductive activities. Idle No More isn't about asking a colonial patriarchal state to give us rights. It's about asserting the inherent rights that we've never given up. And I'm going to finish with a poem that I wrote after receiving this image from Nazareth and organizing with many Palestinian women in solidarity in Canada. It's about how our situations are related. We're half the world but carry the rest of it on our backs. We both live in occupied territories, but what can I know about you, half a world away from me? You and me, we know violence, the pain of our mothers, the memories of this land. We share a history of being moved, removed, moved again, taken from our homes, and wondering if we'll ever go back. We've shared sleepless nights telling, retelling, telling again the stories they tried to take from us, and trying to remember the ones they did. You and me, they see us as passive and weak, disposable and unintelligent, pawns and prizes in the politics of men, as if those boys simply sprung out of the ground. You and me, we're the ones they run over on their way to the revolution, but we're the ones who hold it down at home, Hebron via 20th Street, because we know that even with guns going off in the background, children still have to be fed. So this is for Amal, a 17-year-old girl shot by an IDF soldier while reading a book on her porch. And this is for Inav, the girlfriend that soldier went home and killed 2 years later. Tell me again about your revolution. This is for Anna May, a Mi'kmaq activist executed point blank on Pine Ridge. Her body left in snow to freeze, the voice that had grown a little too strong. Tell me again about your revolution. This is for the women in refugee camps, the 53% forced to endure labor and give birth in the dirt. This is, tell me again about your revolution. This is for the women who never left their houses until the day they were carried out. Tell me again about your revolution. This is for the women who are raped and told that speaking out will dishonor their community, and abortion is a crime, but birth control is nowhere to be seen, so it's best to suffer in silence. Tell me again about your revolution. You and me were the ones who lead the charge in the streets, Intifada and Idle No More, and we won't fight only to return home as servants. So this is for the Arab women who fund girls' schooling, and for the girls who have the courage to learn. You and me, we're the nation. And this is for the mothers and daughters leading movements from Gaza to the grasslands. You and me, we're the resistance. And this is for the women who are told not to speak, not to write, not to dream or feel, not to fight, but do it anyway. You and me, we're the revolution. Thank you.